Greetings. I'm going to talk about the concept of racism, or, well, the nebulous concept of racism, and look into the origin of the term and what it actually means and all of that. So let's begin. This journey starts with this video. This guy's channel, Seth Skorkowski, he just makes videos about tabletop role-playing games, like reviews and other thoughts on role-playing, and it's usually very apolitical, except for like this comment that I am about to play. And the background of this video is it's about Call of Cthulhu, the role-playing game, which is usually set in the 1920s or in some other historical period, and he's sharing some concerns about some aspects of history.
Table. However, a lot of history is extremely ugly, and those ugly parts, whether they be racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, and all sorts of awful things that were happening in the past, those can make a lot of players and keepers uneasy as to how realistically they should portray them. Now, the simple truth is that no matter how much we like getting all the little details of historical accuracy, that's just something that we do for fun in a fantasy game. This is not the real world where your game is taking place. It is a romanticized depiction of the past. In the real world, there is no Arkham, Massachusetts. There is no Miskatonic River, and Shadowed Innsmouth simply does not exist. And if you want to downplay or ignore many of the uglier sides of real history, just for the sake of your fantasy game that takes place in a fantasy world that you are playing for fun, then by all means, please do downplay or ignore those if you want. In my game, I reduce racism and sexism and all that down to individual people and not to institutions. What does that mean? Well, it means that they might occasionally come across their racist jerk, and if they're racist against one character, that character is going to have a penalty die when trying to do any sort of interpersonal interaction with them. However, I don't do the institutionalized racism dealing with the laws. I do the same thing when we've played D&D, you know, where an elf goes into a dwarven town and all the dwarves treat that elf like crap and vice versa. I just don't employ the overwhelming racism and sexism and all the laws that existed in the real world at the time that the game supposedly takes place.
So he brings out the nasty aspects of history, such as racism, homophobia, transphobia, sexism. Well, I think him mentioning those things in particular proves that Gamergate did nothing, like it achieved nothing. First of all, since I've seen, this is just one example of a regular gamer who is still spouting this same old cultural Marxist nonsense about these usual intersectional issues, even though he's probably not like really an active proponent of such ideologies, but he's like a passive repeater of it, probably. I don't know what his actual thoughts on the matter are, but anyway, so he thinks that racism, homophobia, transphobia, and sexism, they are something that people might feel uncomfortable with in historical settings, and I suppose, but it's curious that he, ignores other aspects such as war or poverty or disease. Those kinds of things also are very historical, and I would say even more disturbing than the fact that somebody doesn't approve of your sexual habits or doesn't like the way you look because of your race. I think there are much worse, or like slavery, and it's not simply that slavery existed in colonial America or something. And also, like, he's talking about Call of Cthulhu, which is about these old gods and ancient beings of ancient horrors and monstrosities that defy human sanity and logic and basically render our understanding of science and religions moot and destroy our minds. So this is like a horror game based on H.P. Lovecraft's stories, of course, and supposed to be for mature people, I suppose, but apparently mature people, they're fine with all of this horrendous Cthulhu mythos stuff, and even war. Like if it's set in the 1920s, the Great War just happened like 10 years before. Well, depending of course what particular year in the 20s you started. But anyway, so like for example, in one game of Call of Cthulhu I played, like one campaign, one of the characters had fought in Verdun. I think it's in France, and it was like supposedly a very horrible battleground, I think between the French and the Germans, but whatever. I would say something like that is much more horrific, experiencing that, than being called a nigger or something, or a kike. But of course, this is part of the religion of modernity to care about these racist, sexist, homophobic, all of this crap. So this is why these are mentioned. And let's move on. Okay, so, and of course there's the fact that Lovecraft himself was a quote-unquote racist. Like, there's this article, "We can't ignore H.P. Lovecraft's white supremacy." So yada yada yada, but then there's this making no efforts to conceal his bigoted theories, Lovecraft took to pen and publication with the most grotesque appraisals of those he deemed inferior. His letters overflow with anti-Semitic conspiracy theories of an underground Jewry pitting the economic, social, and literary worlds of New York City against the Aryan race. He warned of the Jew who must be muzzled because he insidiously degrades and orientalizes the robust Aryan civilization. His sympathies with rising fascism were equally transparent. Hitler's vision is romantic and immature, he stated, after Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. "I know he's a clown, but God, I like the boy." Yeah, this is curious since I think Hitler was 1 year older than Lovecraft, but Lovecraft calls him a boy. That's interesting, but whatever. I just found this interesting. And yeah, here it mentions he has a poem entitled "On the Creation of Niggers." I will read it later. And there's another article, "Disturbed by Lovecraft, whose racism and hate weren't merely a product of his times." It is difficult to separate Lovecraft's racism from his stories. For example, The Horror at Red Hook is both one of Lovecraft's most well-known stories and one of his most racist, with Lovecraft describing Aryan civilization as being all that stands against the primitive half-ape savagery of lesser races. I haven't read The Horror at Red Hook. Sounds interesting. I don't want to say most of Lovecraft's stuff, but I guess a majority of his writings, I think, or at least of his like Cthulhu mythos stuff. But whatever. So Lovecraft himself was a quote-unquote racist, or he would discriminate people based on their racial differences, however you want to put it. I just find it somehow pretentious that if you're playing a game based on Lovecraft's the world or the cosmos that Lovecraft created, and then you go out of your way to not be racist. Like, of course I can appreciate Seth Skorkowski's comment on like downplaying some of these issues. Like, sure, I agree with that, but not so much that it's so disturbing if somebody is a racist. But it's more like if you want to focus on the story and trying to be too historically accurate, especially when it comes to quote-unquote racism, can take away from the story. So in that aspect, I can agree with him. However, I don't like his, this like, oh no, like sexism or racism are the worst things ever, and like anything else is fine. Like, yeah, role-playing games, like all sorts of stuff happens, like, some evil warlord or necromancer or somebody might like, murder your family and take you prisoner and torture you and stuff. And that's all fine and dandy, but if the necromancer who has killed your family and friends and tortured you, if they calls you a fucking pointed-eared elf, that's going too far. That's racism. Now it's no longer fun. It's ridiculous. So yeah, here it shows Lovecraft was born 1890, so I think it's 1 year after Hitler, but anyways. So here is on the creation of niggers. I'm gonna read it. When long ago the gods created earth, in Jove's fair-imaged man was shaped at birth. The beasts for lesser parts were next designed, yet were they too remote from humankind. To fill the gap and join the rest of man, the Olympian host conceived a clever plan. Beast they wrought in a semi-human figure, filled it with vice, and called the thing a nigger. I don't know if that's great poetry, but in like modern times, I think it's really funny. Like 100 years ago, well over 100 years ago when it was written, I thought it would be sort of meh. But now, in the current cultural context, I like it. Okay, so let's look at the origin of the term racism. There are a few different explanations I found on the internet, and this isn't like the conclusive explanation on the origin of the term racism, or probably isn't. I haven't found every origin story there is, but let's start with this one. So this article by Dustin Stanley blames Trotsky, Bronstein, the communist Russian leader. His some document from him from 1930, the history of the Russian Revolution, from which shown is above is a passage. The last word in that passage is Rasistov, because here it says Rasistov, whose Latin transliteration is Rasistov, yeah, racists. This work here is the first time in history one will ever find that word. So I don't want to go deeper into this one, but anyway, so this claims that Trotsky is the first one to have used the word, but I found also this one from American Renaissance website, The Origins of Racism. So there's this guy, Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a German Jewish medical scientist whose major work was in the field of what came to be known as sexology, the scientific study of sex, like among the first to collect systematic information about sexuality, but also was an apostle of sexual liberation. His major work was a study of homosexuality, but he also published many other books, monographs, and articles dealing with sex. Blah, blah, blah. It's fair to say that his works were intended to send a message that traditional Christian and bourgeoisie sexual morality was repressive, irrational, and hypocritical, and that emancipation would be a major step forward. And so anyway, he also wrote a book called Racism that was written before his death in 1935, but was published in 1938 or something. And yeah, here it says, racism therefore is a term originating on the left and has been so defined and loaded with meanings the left wants it to have that it cannot now be used by the supporters of white racial consciousness for any constructive purpose. Anyone who uses the term to describe himself or his own views has already allowed himself to be maneuvered onto his opponent's ground and has already lost the debate. He may try to define the word differently, but he will need to spend most of his time explaining that he does not mean by it what everybody else means. As a term used for communicating ideas that the serious supporters of white racial consciousness wish to communicate, the term is useless, and it was intended by those who developed it that it be useless for that purpose. I agree with that wholeheartedly. And here's his Magnus Hirschfeld's Wikipedia page. And yeah, it says that he was an outspoken advocate for sexual minorities. He founded the Scientific Humanitarian Committee, and historian Dustin Goltz characterized this group as having carried out the first advocacy of homosexual and transgender rights. So there's this guy, one possible candidate for being the first person to use the word racism, who is Jewish and is studying sexology and advocating homosexual and transgender rights. I wonder how were transgender quote-unquote rights back in the 20s and 30s, or like in the Lovecraft era as well, because I don't think they really had the technology to make somebody transgender. Like, of course, there were like transvestites or somebody who, probably a man who wanted to be a woman or something, but yeah, anyways. So it's just a Jewish guy doing what Jews tend to do. And, you know, also Trotsky was Jewish, of course. I see a pattern. However, there is one different version to this story. Here, this is from the NPR website. I think it's some American commie, like a news agency or whatever. But this article I found surprisingly decent. So anyways, the ugly, fascinating history of the word racism. The Oxford English Dictionary first recorded utterance of the word racism was by a man named Richard Henry Pratt in 1902. Pratt was railing against the evils of racial segregation. Segregating any class or race of people apart from the rest of the people kills the progress of the segregated people or makes their growth very slow. Association of races and classes is necessary to destroy racism and classism. Sounds very Marxist, although this guy probably wasn't like consciously a Marxist. So he must have been the first person to speak against racism, but he's best known for this quote, "Kill the Indian, save the man." A great general has said that the only good Indian is a dead one, Pratt said. In a sense, I agree with the sentiment, but only in this, that all the Indian there is in the race should be dead. Kill the Indian in him, save the man. So this means, according to my understanding, that he was sort of like the Sargon of Akkad of his time, that he wanted to educate the Indians to be good white people, like to teach them English and Christianity instead of their heathen ways. So I think he thought that all human beings are basically a blank slate, and it's only that your culture, nurture, not nature, determines what kind of person you'll be. That's what it sounds like to me, based on this article. So he started some Carlisle Indian industrial schools for Indians in America. Or at least I think he started them, but whatever. So Pratt pushed for the total erasure of native cultures among his students. No bilingualism was accommodated at these boarding schools, said Christina Snyder, a historian at Indiana University. The students' native tongues were strictly forbidden in a rule that was enforced through beating. Since they were rounded up from different tribes, the only way they could communicate with each other at the schools was in English. Like, this in particular triggers me because of my own history, because 100 years ago, slightly over 100 years ago, when Finland used to be part of the Russian Empire, they also tried to do similar stuff to us, that to, tell us not to speak Finnish and to speak Russian instead. Well, they failed. This is interesting as well. Since there was little oversight of the boarding schools, the students were often subjected to horrific mistreatment. Many were regularly beaten. Chelier said that some of the schools were rife with sexual abuse. Tuberculosis or trachoma, a preventable disease, causes blindness, were rampant. All of their boarding schools, she said, had their own cemeteries. This is liberalism in action. Whether, this guy was a communist, Marxist, whatever, but it's all the same. Like, it doesn't matter if you're, like, I don't think Pratt was Jewish, but he's doing the Jews good work, it seems. And NPR seems to agree with me. For his time, Pratt was definitely a progressive, Snyder said. Indeed, he thought his ideas were the only thing keeping native peoples from being entirely wiped out by disease and starvation. That's one of the dirty little secrets of American progressivism, that progress was still shaped around the ideas of whiteness. And this is quite self-conscious, I would say, from these presumed lefties writing this article, because, well, I think still progressivism is shaped around the idea of whiteness. They is basically trying to teach non-white people how to be white and to, well, get rid of white people. Like, originally, I guess it wasn't about eradicating white people, but now it has progressed that the black guy or the Indian or whoever, they should be like the white people, but white people should be killed. But it still basically assumes that these ideologies that came to be in white countries, I'm not going to say that white people invented them, but they were born in white countries, that, all of the world should adopt these progressive ideas. So I think, Pratt himself, his methodologies and ideas, like, he was supposedly a non-racist progressive, but, well, these were the fruits of his labor, and so it's just insane. I honestly think that, these people who were earnest in trying to help the other races have done much more damage to them than people who openly despise, niggers and Indians and all of that. Because those people mostly just want to stay away from the races they despise, but whereas these, do-gooders, they want to fuck with them and ultimately make it worse for the people they want to help. Anyway, Snyder said that Pratt replaced the popular idea that some groups were natively inferior to others with the idea that some cultures that were the problem and needed to be corrected or destroyed. In other words, he swapped biological determinism for cultural imperialism. Like, this is Sargon of Akkad. Like, I wonder, has Sargon ever even read Richard Henry Pratt? Racism remains a force of enormous consequence in American life, yet no one can be accused of perpetrating it without kicking up a fight. I guess it should be without kicking up a grand fight. No one ever says, yeah, I was a little bit racist, I'm sorry. That's in part because racists in our cultural conversations have become inhuman. They are fairy tale villains and thus can't be real. There's no nuance to these public fights, as a veteran crisis manager told my colleague Hansi Lo Wang. Lo Wang, isn't that from Shadow Warrior, the computer game? Anyway, someone is either a racist and therefore an inhuman monster, or they're an actual complex human being and therefore by definition incapable of being a racist. See, like these leftists, they seem to understand how their terms make no sense, but still they use them. Like, I think this article is directed at other leftists, so they can, have this degree of self-awareness and honesty. But if it was directed at, right-wing racists, like myself, would be, according to them, although I don't really consider myself right-wing, but I don't centrist either, and definitely not a leftist, so whatever. But yeah, this, like, they hit the nail on the head. Like, a racist in people's minds, they have become inhuman. Like in a war, you demonize the enemy, that there's no positive aspect to them. If you kill the enemy, you're doing them a favor. You're doing the whole world a favor. Punch a Nazi, all of that stuff. Hearing these few trigger words literally triggers a hate response in Marxism brainwashed people. Like, the hatred they feel toward racists is stronger than the hatred they feel towards murderers or rapists, as we can see in Europe, when these peaceful immigrants from peaceful countries kill and rape people. They try to either ignore it or defend the rapists, unless of course it's like a white man making a sexist joke, then they're actual racist. But it's basically to do with race. It's not to do with their the criminal actions or lack thereof in these brainwashed people. So yeah, all of these words, racism, sexism, homophobia, they're just there to shut down your rational thought. It's indoctrination, pure and simple. Like here in Finland, talking about the True Finns party, as my last video was about it. Basically, any rational arguments they make are ignored because they are quote-unquote racist. And of course, I'm not saying that every argument that the True Finns make are rational, but certainly some of them are and should be taken seriously. And of course, at least the most ardent leftists, they are not triggered by anti-white racism. They can say on Twitter how they want to kill all white people and end whiteness and all of that stuff, and they're not triggered. Nobody gets triggered about it. Although at least like some centrists find it displeasing. Like even Sargon of Akkad has at least said something about it, but I think it's more like a tactical maneuver on his part, because he's noticed that maybe I shouldn't be too openly a lefty. I should at least pretend that I'm sort of like the cool right-wingers, but not too far. So anyways, these are 3 theories or descriptions, whatever, on the origins of the word racism. Either it's from Trotsky, a communist Jew, Magnus Hirschfeld, a Jewish sexologist, promoter of homosexuality and transgenderism, or this progressive, basically mass murderer, cultural imperialist guy who basically was doing, I don't know, similar stuff that communists, even though he probably wasn't a communist himself in any obvious sense. So take your pick. And of course it's used to manipulate you. So you shouldn't really use the term racism, because you can say that somebody is discriminating against other races or something. And that's not inherently good or bad. Like, people discriminate for any kind of reasons, like whether it's for your height or the color of your shirt, your ideology, sex or age. Like, some at school or somebody, or prison, presumably. I've never been to an actual prison as an inmate. I visited a historical prison in Korea, but anyways. So somebody just might dislike you and discriminate against you because of how you look, your face. They don't like your face, so they dislike you. Like, of course it's not the most noble or rational reason to dislike, but that's just humanity. Like, I find it offensive that these people try to change the core being of being a human. Or like, some guy goes to a bar to, try to score. So he discriminates based on age and sex. Like, let's say a 25-year-old guy wants to find somebody to fuck. They usually choose somebody who is of the opposite sex. and of a similar age with themselves, they wouldn't want to fuck a 5-year-old or a 55-year-old woman. So anyway, like discrimination, like I'm not against that. I'm not against saying that, some people discriminate too much based on race, whether it's positive or negative discrimination. Certainly, I do think that some right-wingers put too much emphasis on race in some matters, but certainly race exists, it's a biological fact, and your race affects you in either cognitive ways or physical ways. So I'm not saying any of that Marxist crap that there is no race or there is only the human race or crap like that. I guess my point is that racism is not a descriptive term. It doesn't describe reality. It's only there to, shut you down. Like in the past, there were slurs or like these words to label you some inhuman, like the NPR article said that racists have become inhuman. So in the past there was like apostate or heretic, like if you were labeled by somebody with actual clout in society as an apostate or heretic, then basically you were excommunicated or just burnt at the stake. And now later on, as I understand, say, history and human behavior better, I'm not even criticizing the concept of calling out heretics and apostates, because some people deserve the stake or to be burnt at the stake or hanged or whatever. But it can also be used as just an excuse to silence people who might be, whether or not they're telling the truth, but at least they should be heard and then determined whether what they're saying makes sense or not. But it's the way of shutting people down to call them a racist, sexist, apostate, heretic, and so on. So it's used by the NPCs as a knee-jerk reaction. And then, as I mentioned that, I guess I should give my 2 cents on the NPC meme. I think, since the meme exists and people are repeating it, I think it's proof that NPCs exist, since that's how NPCs behave. Like, oh, did you hear? Some people, they don't have their inner voice. Oh, they're NPCs, and then the NPCs hear it and then they repeat it and say like, see, I'm not an NPC, I'm repeating the meme. But yeah, basically an NPC, in my opinion, is somebody without self-awareness or independent thought, who basically gain their inner experience solely from what society tells you how you should view the world, instead of trying to draw your own conclusions. And that means that sometimes you draw wrong conclusions if you do it yourself, but still I think it's better than simply repeating whatever society tells you to repeat. But anyways, let's just look at the dictionary definition of racism. A belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. A doctrine or political program based on the assumption of racism and designed to execute its principles. A political or social system founded on racism, or a racial prejudice or discrimination. I don't know, I think they're sort of loaded terms that, race is the primary determinant. Because, is there a word, race realist, but in common vernacular, is there a term for just somebody who recognizes that race exists and it's bound to affect people in some ways? A Doberman dog is bigger than a poodle because of its biological factors, its genes and whatever, so similar things should affect human races differently. I say racial prejudice and discrimination, sure, it exists, because nowadays it's assumed a knee-jerk reaction, if you have racial prejudice or racial discrimination, it's bad, unless it's against white people. But it's not bad according to society if you have a racial prejudice against Nazis, however Nazi is defined by that particular person. So it's a fucking psyop. It's there to manipulate you, to condition you to act like an NPC, like the term racist. But yeah, there used to be the term racialism. So racialism, I guess it was more like a 19th century thing. A theory that race determines human traits and capacities. Like this is something I agree with. Because here it says about racism, a belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capacities. I don't necessarily believe that. But here is a theory that race determines human traits and capacities. Like I don't think that it alone determines like both nature and nurture, and I also think there's like some sort of spiritual aspect, or maybe just a random aspect to your personalities and your capacities and stuff. And yeah, here's the Wikipedia of racialism. Racialism is the belief that human species is naturally divided into races that are ostensibly distinct biological categories. Most dictionaries define the term racialism as synonymous with racism. Well, this is some Orwellian bullshit here, because I think these are different, because racism from its inception, I think, has been a negative label. Like if somebody labels you racist, you're bad. Somebody labels you heretic or something, like I don't think it was like an objective term. Such as like a communist is a proponent of communism, a fascist is a proponent of fascism, a Buddhist is a proponent of Buddhism. But they're not inherently, like there's no like a value judgment in those terms, in my opinion, but there is with racism, I think. And I don't think there is such a value judgment in racialism either. So maybe we should bring back the term racialist. I could be a racialist, of course race realist, but I don't know. I sort of like racialist more, maybe just because it's more old school. But yeah, ultimately I think racism, the term it's meant to distort your sense of reality, that you're somehow weird or like you're extreme or something because you believe in the fact that there are different races in humanity, that there's biologically different qualities in different population clusters, or however you put it scientifically. Because like you don't need to have a special term for the fact that there are two sexes, but now there is cisgender. But for thousands of years it was just understood there's two sexes, and of course sure there's some hermaphrodites, but they're like a mutation in my opinion, like a aberration. Or like there's no specific word for the need to breathe air, that you have to eat food. Like this is something that's understood. And well, it surprises me that otherkin aren't like a mainstream thing yet. Like I wonder when like CNN or something is making a show about otherkin, and like how somebody identifies as a dragon or something it's fine, yeah, if they feel like a dragon, they're a dragon. All of this is like, it is a psyop, there's a war on for your mind. They try to confuse what is real, what is biological, physical, with something that is man-made, like subject to your emotions or prejudices or whatever. Because a race is a thing discriminating people based on various kind of standards. It's a reasonable thing in itself. Like certain standards might not be as good as others, true, but still, sexism as it was in the original this video. He mentioned also sexism, transphobia, homophobia. basically the same stuff applies to them, except it's not about race, it's about all this, gender identity crap. And this, already back in the 30s, it was all about intersectionality, because he wrote about his book about racism, and he was also promoting gay and transgender rights and all of that stuff. So it all comes to back together. It's all about subverting what is natural, what is traditional, what has existed for thousands of years in pretty much every functional society in history. And then you can say, like, well, the Greeks engaged in sodomy back in the day, and well, yeah, that's why their society fell. So yeah, racism is not a thing. Transphobia, homophobia, well, Islamophobia, none of them are real things. They are a manipulation of your mind to make you think that this is something you should be concerned about. Like, ultimately, like, of course, you can discriminate wrongly people based on them being a Muslim or a woman or a faggot or something. It's conceivably possible, certainly, but this is like an excessive that immediately when you think about discriminating in a reasonable, like when you want to discriminate reasonably, that maybe I shouldn't hire this Muslim to my company because, well, I don't know anything about them and they don't really speak my language or anything. So because you can also reasonably discriminate against somebody, or like, I don't want to hire this faggot to my kindergarten or somebody because it's a known phenomenon that faggots spread their faggot virus onto children. Not all of them, but many of them. So yeah, discrimination is fine when you do it right, and racism is bullshit.